The most dangerous thing about Daniel Harrow was how easily he let things go. Outside the courthouse on a Tuesday in November, rain fell in thin, indifferent sheets against the marble steps. Daniel stood under the narrow overhang, hands loose at his sides, watching his attorney fold papers into a briefcase with the careful precision of someone who had learned not to make eye contact after settlements. The papers were signed. The marriage was over. He had accepted the terms, the house, the accounts, the investment portfolio, all of it, without a single counteroffer. His attorney, a man named Feldman who had seen 1,000 divorces and remembered approximately none of them, had asked Daniel 3 times if he was certain. Daniel had said yes each time, his voice the same temperature as the November air. What Feldman didn't understand, what no one in that building understood, was that Daniel wasn't being passive. He was being precise. What he didn't know yet was that his precision, that careful, deliberate stillness, would cost him everything he hadn't yet realized he wanted. 6 years earlier, Daniel Harrow had been the kind of man people described using words like solid. Not brilliant, not magnetic. Solid. He had built a small logistics firm from a 2-desk office above a dry cleaner in Midtown into a regional operation with 43 employees and contracts that kept the lights on through recessions. He drove a sensible car. He paid his taxes early. He coached his daughter Lily's soccer team on Saturday mornings not because he was passionate about soccer, but because someone had to, and he was there. His wife, Cassandra, Cass, to everyone, was the kind of woman who wore her ambition the way other women wore jewelry. Visibly, intentionally, in rooms designed to notice. She was a VP at a media consultancy by 31, a partner by 34, and by 36 she had concluded, through a process she would later describe to her friends as personal growth, that Daniel's particular brand of solid was another word for ceiling. She didn't leave cruelly. That was almost worse. She left with the organized efficiency of someone closing a chapter in a business plan. The lawyers were retained before Daniel noticed anything was wrong. He learned this later. He'd been at Lily's school play the night Cass made her decision. Lily played a tree. He still had the photograph on his refrigerator. Lily in brown and green, arms raised like branches, grinning the unself-conscious grin of a 7-year-old who doesn't yet know that some performances are for other people. Daniel had taken 43 photos that night. Cass had not come. He hadn't asked why at the time. He had assumed work. He had always assumed work. What he had not assumed, what had not occurred to him as a category of possible event, was that while he was photographing his daughter pretending to be a tree, his wife was having dinner with a man named Garrett who ran a boutique private equity firm and who had, in Cass's words, a vision for where things were going. Daniel had no opinion about visions. He was occupied with the present. The divorce proceedings had taken 4 months. Daniel attended every session with the same quality of attention he brought to contract negotiations, thorough, quiet, unhurried. He had noted, without bitterness, that Cass's attorney was considerably more expensive than his own. He had signed what he was asked to sign. When Feldman presented him with the final terms that left him the car, his business, his clothes, and Lily on alternating weeks, Daniel had not protested. Cass kept the house. Cass kept the accounts. Cass kept the future they had built together, which, upon examination, turned out to have been mostly her future the whole time. He had simply been present for it, the way furniture is present for a life. He drove home from the courthouse that November Tuesday in the sensible car, Lily asleep in the back seat, her muddy cleats leaving careful prints on the floor mat. He had picked her up from practice after the signing. He had not told her what the papers were. She was 8 now. She understood more than she let on. He knew this because when he carried her inside and laid her on her bed, she opened one eye and said, without preamble, "Did something happen today?" He said, "No." She closed her eye. She did not believe him. He knew she did not believe him because she reached out and held his hand for a moment before her breathing deepened into sleep. He sat on the edge of her bed in the dark for a long time, her small hand in his, listening to the ring. The apartment came furnished, which meant it came with someone else's choices. A gray sectional sofa that was comfortable but expressed nothing. A dining table in a wood finish that didn't quite match any of the other surfaces. 3 prints on the walls that Daniel would later describe, to no one in particular, as inoffensive. He found himself oddly grateful for the impersonality of it. He didn't have to decide anything. He could just exist inside the choices made by someone who had already moved on. He built a new routine the way he built everything, methodically, without drama. Lily arrived Friday afternoon. She left Sunday evening. In between, he made pancakes in shapes that were recognizably animals if you were generous, helped with homework that was beginning to exceed his comfort level in certain mathematical directions, and watched whatever she wanted to watch on the laptop balance between them on the break section. He did not perform contentedly. She would have noticed. The logistics firm continued. His operations manager, a woman named Priya who had been with him since the Midtown office and who communicated primarily in direct statements and unsparing assessments, told him 3 months after the divorce that he needed to either hire 2 people or sleep more, because the current situation was unsustainable. He hired 1 person and slept slightly more. This was his version of compromise. The business was, in fact, doing something he had not entirely planned for. It was growing. The regional contracts had expanded. 2 national accounts had signed in January, unexpectedly, following a logistics breakdown at a competitor that had sent 3 of their clients into the market looking for stability. Daniel's reputation, solid, always solid, had translated into a kind of professional appeal in a moment when the industry was performing its own version of instability. He reinvested everything. He always reinvested everything. He did not tell Cass about the contracts. He did not tell Cass about much anymore. Their communication had reduced to logistics of a different kind. Pickup times, schedule changes, Lily's dentist appointment, the matter of a winter coat that had migrated between households and could not be accounted for. They were efficient correspondence. They were nothing else. The apartment that had felt temporary began to feel, not permanent exactly, but inhabitable. He put Lily's drawings on the refrigerator. He bought a coffee maker that ground its own beans, which was the most luxurious thing he owned and which he justified to himself as a long-term investment in morning efficiency. He did not yet know what he was building toward. He knew only that he was still building. This was the thing about Daniel Harrow. He could not stop. He met her at Lily's school. Not met, precisely. Noticed. The distinction mattered to Daniel, though he couldn't have articulated why at the time. It was a Thursday in March, parent pickup, and the parking lot of Lily's school operated on rules that appeared to have developed organically from mutual exasperation rather than any formal authority. Daniel had his system. He arrived 4 minutes early, parked in the second row, and read contract documents on his phone until the doors opened. This had worked without incident for 2 years. On this Thursday, there was a woman parked in a silver SUV in a position that technically wasn't a space, and she was reading something. A book, not a phone, an actual book, with the door open and 1 foot resting on the door frame, with the casual completeness of someone who had decided this was where she was going to be and had made her peace with that. She was wearing work clothes, slightly rumpled. She had not adjusted them upon noticing anyone. The book's spine was too worn to read from this distance. She did not look up. This, more than anything, was what Daniel noticed, the quality of her not looking up. It was not performative. It was not strategic. It was simply that she was reading, and he was not part of that sentence. He went back to his contracts. He saw her the following Thursday, and the one after that. She was always in a slightly different position, but always with the book, always with the quality of complete self-containment, like a figure in a painting that required no context to make sense. He learned, through the school's informal information network, which operated mainly through a parent named Douglas who knew everything and could not be prevented from sharing it, that her name was Elena Vasquez, that she was a pediatric occupational therapist with a practice 2 miles from the school, that she had a son named Marco in the same grade as Lily, and that she had been a single parent for 3 years following the death of her husband in a car accident on a wet highway in February. Douglas delivered this information in the tone of someone providing background for a story that was about to happen. Daniel had said, "Thanks, Douglas," and returned to his contracts. The children met before the parents did, in the way children do, suddenly and without introduction, some mutual recognition that precedes language and has nothing to do with decision. Lily came to the car one Thursday bouncing on her heels in a specific way that Daniel had learned to associate with news she was arranging into the right words. She said that there was a boy in her class named Marco who could do a trick with a pencil and that she had done a better trick back, and that they were now, apparently, in some kind of collaborative creative enterprise that involved a notebook and an ongoing dispute about whether dragons or sharks were more scientifically viable as pets. His mom is the one with the book, Lily added, as though this were relevant data Daniel had been waiting for. He said, "Okay." She looked at him with the evaluative precision that she had inherited from him and used on her regularly. "She's nice," she said. "Marco says she makes really good tortillas. That's a useful skill," Daniel said. Lily gave him a look again. He kept his eyes on the road. The school was organizing a fundraiser, a Saturday afternoon event in the gymnasium that had the ambition of a carnival and the budget of a bake sale. And through a sequence of logistical steps that Daniel followed but felt he had not quite controlled, he ended up staffing the ring toss booth from 11 to 1, and Elena Vasquez ended up staffing the booth directly adjacent, which involved a wheel of fortune and prizes that appeared to have been donated by people clearing out their garages. She acknowledged him with a nod when she arrived. She set up her booth with economical, practiced movements. She did not make small talk. He appreciated this. They worked their adjacent booths for 20 minutes in a silence that was not uncomfortable. Then a child threw a ring that landed 2 booths over, which required a brief logistical coordination between Daniel and Elena to determine whose prize inventory it came from. She looked at the ring, looked at her inventory, looked at him. "Mine," she said. "Are you sure? It's yellow. I have the yellow rings." He handed it back. She gave the child the prize without ceremony. She returned to her booth. 15 minutes later, Marco and Lily arrived together. A unit already, somehow, the notebook under Lily's arm, and Marco tugged on Elena's sleeve and said, in the direct manner of a 9-year-old who doesn't know there are situations where you do not introduce people, "Mom, this is Lily's dad." Elena looked at Daniel. "I know," she said. "The parking lot." He said, "Yes." She looked at him for a moment in the way she had looked at the ring, assessing, brief, conclusive. "Elena," she said, and put out her hand. "Daniel," he said, and shook it. That was, for a while, the whole of it. There are friendships that develop because people decide to pursue them, and there are the kind that develop because circumstances keep providing the same 2 people with adjacent situations, and eventually resistance becomes more work than acceptance. Daniel and Elena were the second kind. It was not romance. He was careful about this in his own accounting of it, because Daniel Harrow was a man who kept careful accounts. They were parallel parents whose children had formed an alliance and who therefore occupied the same logistical orbit. School events, Saturday afternoon pickups when one of them had a conflict, the occasional Tuesday when Marco needed somewhere to be after school and Elena's afternoon ran long. It was practical. It was convenient. It was, he admitted to himself on a Sunday evening, while washing the 2 extra plates from a dinner that had extended longer than he'd intended, beginning to feel like something he would notice the absence of. Elena did not perform friendship. She did not ask questions she wasn't prepared to hear the answers to. She spoke in the declarative, and she listened in the full sense. Not the waiting for her turn sense, but the kind that made a room quieter. He had known her for 3 months before she said anything about her husband, and she said it simply, in the middle of a conversation about Lily's homework, as a piece of context rather than a confession. Marco's father would have understood the math. "I don't," Daniel had said. "I'll help Marco with the math." She had said, "Okay." That was the agreement. It was also something else. Neither of them named it. Lily had noticed. Of course she had. She had her mother's ability to notice and her father's discretion about what to do with the information, which meant she sat on it for 2 weeks and then asked, while Daniel was cooking dinner, "Is Elena your friend?" Daniel said, "Yes." Lily stirred the pasta she had been assigned to stir. "A regular friend or a different kind of friend?" "A regular friend," Daniel said. The pasta required stirring. He stirred it. Lily watched him. "Okay," she said, in the tone she used when she accepted information she was continuing to evaluate. The business crossed a threshold in May that Daniel had not expected until Q3. The second national account renewed early. A third company, a distribution operation out of Atlanta that had been managed by a competitor with a reputation for cost-cutting that had finally caught up with them, came to Daniel through a referral and signed a contract that was, in Priya's exact words, the kind of number that changes what you are. Priya had never been given to overstatement. Daniel reread the contract. Then he sat at his desk for a long time with his hands flat on the table, the way he sat when he was arriving somewhere he hadn't realized he'd been traveling toward. He called Feldman, not because Feldman was still his divorce attorney, but because Feldman was a man who had seen how Daniel Harrow operated under pressure and had apparently respected it enough to become, over 2 years, something like an advisor. Feldman reviewed the figures. He used the word restructure. He used the phrase asset positioning. He said, "Daniel, you understand what this means." Daniel said, "I understand what this means." He drove home. He made dinner. He helped Lily with an essay about ecosystems. He did not call Cass. He was very careful not to call Cass. There are men who, in discovering that they have become wealthy, feel the immediate desire to be seen becoming wealthy. Daniel felt the opposite thing, a precise, almost territorial privacy about it. The numbers belonged to the work. The work had happened in the years when nothing seemed to be happening. The growth had occurred in the rooms after Lily went to sleep and before the alarm went off, and in every decision to reinvest instead of extract. He had not performed any of it. He was not going to begin performing it now. Over the following weeks, he did what Priya and Feldman told him to do. He restructured. He positioned. He made 3 specific decisions involving assets that he would have called unreachable 2 years earlier and which were now simply choices. He did not buy anything visible. He did not change any behavior that Lily would have noticed. He did not mention any of it to Elena. He thought about whether to tell Elena. He reached no conclusion. He set the question aside the way he set all questions he couldn't yet answer, in a labeled place, to return to when more data was available. In July, Cass filed for a modification. The papers arrived on a Wednesday. Daniel read them at his kitchen table with the same quality of attention he'd brought to the original divorce proceedings, which was total and unhurried and gave nothing back. The modification sought to revise the custody arrangement, not eliminate his access, but reduce it. Cass's attorney had found, or constructed, a narrative in which Daniel's work schedule constituted a form of absence, in which the apartment constituted insufficient stability, in which Lily's best interests were served by a more primary residence. The modification also, buried in the 4th section, referenced Daniel's company in terms that suggested an interest in financial reconsideration. Priya, when Daniel showed her the papers, said, "So she found out." He said, "She found out." There was a silence in which Priya did not say several things she was thinking, which was one of the many reasons Daniel valued her. Then she said, "What are you going to do?" Daniel folded the papers with the same care he had folded the original settlement. He said, "What I always do." He called Feldman. He described the situation. He said, "I need a different kind of attorney now." Feldman said he knew someone. Elena found out about the modification the way Elena found out about most things involving Daniel, through the children. Lily, apparently, had overheard a phone call she wasn't meant to overhear and had communicated its emotional content to Marco using the private language of their ongoing notebook, which Marco had then shown to Elena in the manner of someone presenting evidence. She came to his door on a Thursday evening. She had the book under her arm. She almost always had the book. She said, "The kids are worried." He said, "I know." She came inside. He made coffee. She sat at the kitchen table and did not ask him to explain himself. She waited, in the way she waited for Marco to arrive at his own conclusions about homework, with the patience of someone who understood that some things need the full duration of their own arrival. He told her about the modification. He told her about the business, in the plain language of fact. He did not perform either piece of information. He watched her receive it. She was quiet for a long time after. Not the silence of someone processing. The silence of someone who had already understood something and was deciding whether to say it. Finally, she said, "You never told me." He said, "No." She said, "Why?" He didn't answer immediately. He looked at his coffee. He looked at the drawings on the refrigerator. He looked at her. He said, "I didn't know what it would mean." She nodded. It was not forgiveness and it was not accusation. It was simply acknowledgement, which from Elena Vasquez was more than most people would. She said, "What happens now?" She said, "There's a hearing. October." She said, "Okay. Then, the kids want to go to the aquarium on Saturday." He said, "Okay." She left. He stood at the kitchen window and watched her car until the taillights disappeared around the corner, and then he stood there a while longer in the dark, his hand on the glass. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday in October. 2 years, almost to the week, since the papers had been signed on that November Tuesday in the rain. Daniel noted the symmetry without finding it meaningful. He was not a man who trusted symmetry. Cass's new attorney was, as expected, expensive. His name was Whitmore, and he had the kind of presence in a conference room that filled the available space without motion, the professional equivalent of weather. He had reviewed the discovery thoroughly. He had constructed a narrative about Lily that Cass appeared to believe or had decided to believe, which was a distinction that no longer interested Daniel. The night before the hearing, Lily was with him. She knew something was happening. She had Cass's ability to read a room and Daniel's ability to say nothing about what she read. They ate dinner without talking about it. They played a card game she'd been learning, something complicated with dragons on the cards, and he let her win twice and beat her genuinely once, because she needed both things and she was old enough to know the difference. When she went to bed, she held on slightly longer than usual. He held on slightly longer than usual. After she was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table with the financial documents Feldman's replacement had prepared. She was a woman named Iris Chun, 44, who had the demeanor of someone who had never been surprised by a document and did not intend to start now. She had told Daniel, at their first meeting, that the modification had very little legal standing on custody grounds and a clear financial motivation that they would be able to demonstrate. She had said this with the flat certainty of someone stating a weather forecast for a city she lived in. He trusted her. He went to bed at midnight. He slept, which surprised him. In the morning, he drove Lily to school. She got out of the car, started toward the building, then turned around and came back. She knocked on the window. He lowered it. She said, "You're going to be okay." He said, "I know." She said, "I know you know. I'm just saying it out loud." She went inside. He sat in the parking lot for a full minute. Then he drove to the parking garage 2 blocks from the courthouse and got out of the sensible car and put on his jacket. Not the work jacket, the other one. The one that had been hanging in the bag from the tailor for 3 weeks because he hadn't needed to pick it up until now. He walked to the courthouse. He was, as always, for minutes early. He had not planned the car. That was the thing that later became the story, the detail that turned the proceeding into something that people who hadn't been there would describe and exaggerate over time. The Lamborghini. As though the car was the point. As though Daniel Harrow had arrived in a statement. What had actually happened was this. Iris Chun had a client, a man named Sorensen who made a specific kind of investment and had, for reasons that would take longer to explain than were available that morning, asked Daniel several weeks earlier if he would be interested in a particular vehicle on a long-term trial basis, a question that had been about business and about Sorensen's collection logistics and not, in any sense, about optics or court dates. Daniel had said yes because the terms were interesting and because Priya had told him to stop making decisions based on what they would look like and start making decisions based on what they were. He had picked up the car on Saturday. He had driven it exactly twice. On the morning of the hearing, it had been the car in the garage. He had driven it because it was there. He had parked it 2 blocks away because he didn't want to perform anything. He had walked to the courthouse in the jacket. Whitmore saw him arrive and paused his conversation with an associate. The pause was very brief. Daniel noted it. Cass saw him from the corridor. Her expression moved through something and then resolved into something controlled. He nodded to her in the way you nod to someone you shared a decade of your life with, and who has retained a separate attorney to restructure that decade's meaning. Professionally, adequately, Iris Chun was already in position, which he had expected. She had 3 documents open on the table and the expression of someone who had reviewed the field and found it satisfactory. She said, "Morning," without looking up from the documents. He sat down. He was not nervous. This was not performance. He had done the work. He had made the decisions. He had signed the papers and paid the taxes and coached the Saturday soccer and been present for the school play and ordered a coffee maker that ground its own beans and made pancakes in animal shapes and read contracts at pickup and helped Marco with mathematics and shared kitchen tables with a woman who had a book under her arm and enough stillness to fill a room. He had not done any of it as a case. He had done it as a life. Whatever Whitmore had prepared, Daniel Harrow was not a story that needed to be explained. The proceeding took 4 hours. Whitmore presented. He was good. Daniel gave him that. He had organized the custody argument with care. He had found specific work-related dates. He had a witness, a neighbor from the building, who had something to say about the hours of lights in the apartment. He presented the financial context with strategic imprecision, enough to imply that Daniel's success had been concealed, not enough to say anything that could be disproven, because Iris Chun would disprove anything that could be. Iris Chun, when it was her turn, did not raise her voice. She never raised her voice. She laid documents on the table with the patience of someone placing stones across a stream, each one deliberate, each one load-bearing. School attendance records, both parents. Communication logs, both parents. Medical records. Lily had had 3 appointments in the past year, all 3 attended by Daniel. The financial disclosure was complete and organized and demonstrated not concealment, but reinvestment. The behavior not of a man hiding resources, but of a man building something who did not stop to announce each floor of the construction. She called one witness. Priya, in the witness chair, was more frightening than Iris Chun precisely because she had no legal training and could not be accused of spin. She spoke in the direct, unornamented language of someone who has been in a small office with a man for 6 years and observed his behavior without being asked to observe it. She said what she knew. She did not embellish. When Whitmore cross-examined and suggested that the business's growth had been deliberately obscured, Priya looked at him with an expression that was not hostile, but was the opposite of persuadable, and said, "He doesn't talk about it because he's working. He doesn't announce things. He builds them." Whitmore had no follow-up. The judge reviewed documents for a long time. Then she spoke. Daniel listened. He had the quality of listening he always had. Total, patient, returned nothing until it was his to return. The modification was denied on custody grounds. The financial petition was dismissed. Lily stayed the schedule she'd always stayed. Alternating weeks. His Friday to her Sunday. He shook Iris Chen's hand. She said, "Good work." He wasn't sure if she meant him or herself. He assumed both. He walked past Cass in the corridor without stopping. She said his name. He turned. She said, "You could have told me." He said, "Yes." She waited for something more. He said, "I'll have Lily back Sunday." He walked out. The car was parked 2 blocks away, and it was October, and the sky had cleared to a specific shade of blue that only exists in October, that color that seems to have been washed clean. He drove without destination for 20 minutes, which he almost never did. He drove past the school, past the dry cleaner below his old office, through the neighborhood where he and Cass had lived, the house sitting there with its current life going on inside it, the hydrangeas he'd planted visible above the fence, enormous and overgrown now in the way plants become when the person who planted them is no longer present to manage them. He drove to Elena's practice. He didn't call first. He was aware this was not like him. She was between patients. Her assistant brought him to a small room with children's drawings on the walls and a table covered in the tools of a profession that required precision and patience in equal measure, small weighted objects, textured surfaces, various instruments for helping small hands learn what hands were made for. He stood looking at the drawings while he waited. They were enormous and uninhibited, the work of children who didn't yet know that scale required justification. She came in and saw him and stopped in the doorway. He said, "We won." She said, "I know. Iris texted me." He looked at her. "You know Iris? I referred her to you." He stood with this. He replayed several months of logistics and couldn't find the moment. He said, "Why didn't you tell me?" She said, "You needed to trust her on her own merits." He looked at her across the small room with its children's drawings and its careful instruments. He thought about precision, about what it looked like from the outside, about the things he had not said over months of kitchen tables and school events and Saturdays at the aquarium, all of it accumulating in the way accounts accumulate when you reinvest instead of extract. He said, "Elena." She said, "Daniel." He said, "I don't know what I'm doing." She said, "Yes, you do." This was the most honest exchange they had ever had, and it lasted approximately 12 seconds, and neither of them moved. Then Marco appeared in the doorway behind Elena, arriving from wherever children arrive from, a drawing in his hand and the expression of someone who has not read the room because the room has not told him to. He looked at Daniel. He held up the drawing. "I made this at school," he said. "The teacher said it was too big. I don't think size is the problem." The drawing was a shark and a dragon, engaged in what appeared to be a cooperative enterprise. They were roughly the same scale. Neither was winning. Daniel looked at it for a long time. He said, "I think the teacher is wrong." Marco considered this with the gravity it deserved. He said, "Lily thought so too. They didn't rush anything." That was the thing about Daniel Harrow. He didn't perform, and he didn't rush. What followed was not a sweep or a revelation. It was an accumulation of already existing things recognized for what they were. More kitchen tables. More Saturdays. The aquarium again, and this time the children ran ahead and he and Elena walked at the pace of two people who have nowhere more important to be. He bought Lily a book about marine biology. Elena bought Marco a small model of a hammerhead shark that he immediately named and which was never referred to by any name except its own. They told the children in the way parents tell children things that are not emergencies, plainly, at the kitchen table, with the matter-of-fact delivery that children respect more than ceremony. Lily asked 2 questions. Marco asked 1. Then they returned to the notebook. The business continued. Priya hired the second person she'd been asking for. Daniel moved to an office that was not above a dry cleaner. Though he had considered keeping the address for reasons he couldn't quite articulate and eventually let go of. The sensible car stayed the sensible car. The other car went back to Sorensen in November. Its purpose served, its story already ahead of the actual events. Cass remarried in the spring. He heard about it through Lily, who reported it in the neutral tone of a child who has learned to present information and wait to see what it requires. It required nothing from him. He said, "I hope she's happy." He meant it. Not with warmth, not with bitterness, with the simple, clear intention of a man who has stopped confusing the past with the present. Lily looked at him with the evaluative look. She said, "You already are." He didn't answer. He turned back to the pancakes. They were in the shape of something that might have been a shark, or might have been a dragon. He hadn't decided yet. The aquarium had a room, deep in its center, where the tanks surrounded you on all sides and above. A full enclosure of water and motion and light filtered through blue. You could stand in the center of it and feel the weight of the water on every side and still breathe, still be still, because the glass held. He had stood in this room a dozen times now. Each time, he'd stood in a slightly different place. On a Saturday in the following spring, he stood in the center of the room with Elena beside him and Lily and Marco somewhere ahead, their voices audible through the blue light, arguing with the specific energy of children arguing about something they both love. A large ray moved above them, its motion as unhurried as a thought. It cast a shadow. It passed. He thought about the courthouse, about November rain, about a signed paper and a sensible car, and the particular silence of a furnished apartment chosen by someone else. He thought about Saturday mornings coaching soccer for a sport he had no passion for, because someone had to and he was there. About a coffee maker that ground its own beans. About 43 photographs of a child pretending to be a tree. He thought about what it cost to let everything go. He thought about what he'd found on the other side of that cost. Elena's hand found his hand. Not reaching, not asking, simply arriving. The way she arrived was, without performance or announcement. The ring moved on. Lily's voice carried back to them, bright and unhurried. The glass held.